The dinner conversation at the sprawling Tribeca penthouse had lulled into a comfortable, wine-induced hum until Elena placed a sympathetic hand on her husband's arm and sighed. We've just learned to accept that Daniel's biology simply won't allow us to be parents. It was a lie delivered with such practiced sorrow that even Daniel almost believed it, had he not found the blister pack of contraceptives hidden in her vanity just an hour before. The room offered him pity, but beneath the table, his fist clenched white. He realized his marriage wasn't a tragedy, it was a performance. If you want to witness the moment a man stops playing the victim and starts planning his silent, devastating exit, stay with me, because the truth is about to get loud. The air in the private dining room of Le Cuckoo was thick with the scent of roasted duck and the heavy, expensive perfume of women who had never touched a subway rail. Daniel Thorne sat at the head of the table, nursing a glass of Pinot Noir that cost more than his first car, listening to the sound of his own humiliation being served as an appetizer. We're looking into adoption, of course, Elena said, her voice dropping to that husky, tragic register she reserved for her most attentive audiences. She rested her hand on Daniel's forearm, a touch that looked affectionate but felt like a restraint. But Daniel is, hesitant. It's hard for a man to accept that his line ends with him. Isn't it, darling? Seven faces turned toward Daniel. He saw pity in the eyes of the women and uncomfortable relief in the eyes of the men. Relief that their virility wasn't the topic of conversation. We're still exploring options, Daniel said, his voice steady, though his throat felt like it was packed with sawdust. Oh, sweetie, don't be brave for them, Elena interrupted gently, squeezing his arm. Her nails dug slightly into his suit jacket. Dr. Aris said the motility issues are severe. It's a genetic dead end. But I've told Daniel I didn't marry him for a baby. I married him for him. A collective awe rippled through the group. Elena smiled, a martyr in Yves Saint Laurent, soaking up the adoration. She was the devoted wife standing by her broken man. Daniel took a long sip of wine to keep from screaming. For 3 years, this had been their narrative. The monthly disappointments, the negative tests left on the bathroom counter, the tears Elena wept into his shoulder at night. He had hated himself for it. He had apologized to her 1,000 times for denying her the one thing she claimed to want. He had felt like half a man, walking through a life he couldn't populate. But tonight the shame didn't sit right. It felt curated. Earlier that evening, while Elena was in the shower, Daniel had gone into her dressing room to find a lint roller. He had knocked over a stack of hardcover art books on her vanity. One had fallen open, a hollowed-out copy of modernist sculpture. Inside wasn't jewelry or cash, but a blister pack of birth control pills. Yaz. 3 weeks punched out. He had stared at the foil packet, his mind racing to make it make sense. Maybe they were old, but the expiration date was 2 years in the future. Maybe she was taking them for her skin, but she had never mentioned it. And if she was taking them, why hide them inside a book? Daniel? He snapped back to the dinner. Elena was looking at him, her eyes wide and glassy with performed concern. You've gone somewhere else. Are you okay? Just tired, Daniel said, forcing the corners of his mouth up. The project in Hudson Yards is demanding. He works too hard, Elena told the table, creating a seamless segue. To distract himself, I think. Daniel looked at his wife. He looked at the curve of her neck, the diamond pendant he had bought her for their 5th anniversary, and the way her phone screen lit up face down on the table every few minutes. She ignored it, but her hand twitched toward it instinctively each time. Genetic dead end, she had called him. He looked down at his plate. The steak was rare, bleeding slightly onto the white porcelain. I need to use the restroom, Daniel stood up abruptly. Hurry back, Elena said, blowing him a kiss. He walked out of the dining room, past the hostess stand, and into the corridor. He didn't go to the restroom. He walked to the coat check, retrieved his phone from his overcoat pocket, and stepped out into the cool November air of Lafayette Street. His hands were shaking, not from cold, but from a rage so cold it burned. He unlocked his phone and pulled up the browser history he had synced from their home iPad earlier that day, a hunch he hadn't wanted to indulge. There were no searches for fertility clinics, no searches for adoption agencies, but there were searches for best weekend getaways, Catskills adult only, and a Zillow link for a loft in Soho, far too small for a family, sent to an email address he didn't recognize. Sculptor, your Julian, 88. Daniel took a deep breath, inhaling the exhaust in the rain. He wasn't sterile. He was being played. He looked back through the restaurant window. Elena was laughing now, her head thrown back, touching the arm of the man next to her. She looked radiant. She looked free. She looked like a woman who had solved the problem of a boring husband by turning him into a sympathetic prop. Daniel put his phone back in his pocket. He wouldn't storm back in there. He wouldn't flip the table. That's what a guilty man would do. He turned and walked back inside, adjusting his cufflinks. He would sit through dessert. He would pay the check. He would let her tell her story one last time, because tomorrow he was going to see a doctor. And once he had the paper in his hand, the story would change. The waiting room of the Sterling Institute for Reproductive Medicine on Park Avenue smelled of lavender and antiseptic, a scent designed to mask anxiety, but which only seemed to preserve it. Daniel sat on a mid-century modern sofa that cost more than most people's rent, clutching a clipboard he didn't need to hold. He had taken a sick day from the firm, the first in 4 years. He told Elena he had a migraine. She had kissed his forehead with that same practiced sympathy, told him to rest, and then breezed out the door to meet a client for brunch. Mr. Thorne? A nurse in periwinkle scrubs stood by the frosted glass door. Daniel stood up. His legs felt heavy, like he was wading through water. Dr. Sterling was a man of few words, with silver hair and hands that looked like they had never made a mistake. He didn't offer Daniel a pitying look. He offered him a chart. The examination had been intrusive and humiliating, but the waiting was worse. The silence in the private consultation room was so absolute that Daniel could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, marking away the final seconds of his ignorance. "We ran the full panel," Dr. Sterling said, sitting down and adjusting his glasses. He slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany desk. "Sperm count, motility, morphology, hormonal levels." Daniel stared at the paper. The numbers meant nothing to him, but the bold headers stood out. "And," Daniel asked, his voice cracking, "Mr. Thorne, if you were a donor, you would be in the top 1 percentile," Dr. Sterling said flatly. "Your reproductive health is exceptional. There is absolutely no physiological reason why you cannot father a child." The air left the room. Daniel felt a strange buzzing in his ears. "But," Daniel stammered, his mind scrambling to reconcile this with 3 years of sorrow. "My wife, she said Dr. Aris told her my motility was non-existent. She said it was a genetic dead end." Dr. Sterling frowned, tapping a pen against the desk. "Dr. Aris, the urologist at Mount Sinai?" "Yes, I know Aris well. He doesn't make mistakes like that," Sterling said, leaning forward. "And even if your count fluctuates, non-existent is a definitive term. Based on these numbers, you haven't had a motility issue in your life." Daniel sat back, the leather chair creaking under his weight. "She showed me the papers, the lab results." "Mr. Thorne," Dr. Sterling said gently, his tone shifting from clinical to cautious. "In this age of digital editing, papers can be adjusted. Did you attend the appointments with her?" "No," Daniel whispered. "She said she didn't want me to see the process. She said it was too painful for her to have me watch her get disappointed." The doctor took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He had seen this before. "I can't speak to your wife's motivations, but I can speak to science. You are not infertile. In fact, you are the opposite. If you and your wife have been having unprotected sex for 3 years without a pregnancy, the issue, if there is one, does not lie with you. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, "or she is on birth control." Daniel thought of the foil packet in the hollowed-out book, the Yaz, the 3 pills missing from the current month. "Thank you, doctor," Daniel said. He stood up, taking the paper. His hand was steady now. The shaking had stopped. He walked out of the office and into the elevator. As the door slid shut, enclosing him in the mirrored box, he looked at his reflection. He didn't look like the sad, broken man from the dinner party anymore. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a long, suffocating coma. He stepped out onto Park Avenue. The November wind whipped at his coat, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt a burning clarity. He took his phone out. A text from Elena popped up on the screen. "Thinking of you, darling. Hope the migraine is better." Julian and I are just discussing the sculpture placement. Home by 6. Love you. Daniel stared at the words. Love you. They look different now. They didn't look like affection. They looked like a leash. He didn't reply. Instead, he opened his banking app. He checked the joint account, then his personal savings. He needed a plan. He needed to know exactly how deep the rot went before he cut it out. He hailed a taxi. Wall Street, he told the driver, and take the long way. He wasn't going home to confront her. Not yet. That would be too easy. She had spent 3 years building a cage for him. He was going to take the time to dismantle it, bar by bar, until she was the one trapped inside. The penthouse was silent, save for the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator and the rhythmic breathing of the woman sleeping in the master bedroom. Elena slept with the peaceful, heavy abandon of the guiltless. She had returned home at 6, smelling of white wine and gallery dust, and had played the part of the doting wife through a dinner of grilled salmon. She had even touched his cheek and asked if his migraine had subsided, her eyes wide with a concern that felt almost genuine. Daniel had sat there chewing, swallowing, and smiling. He was learning that the face is a mask that can be tightened with practice. Now at 2:01 a.m., Daniel sat in his home office, the glow of the 27-inch iMac illuminating his face in stark, blue relief. He wasn't an architect for nothing. He understood that every structure had a load-bearing wall, and if you found the crack in it, the whole thing would come down. He had guessed her passcode weeks ago, 0812, the date they met, but had never used it. Tonight, he typed it into the shared iCloud drive that synced with her private MacBook. He bypassed the obvious folders labeled gallery and taxes. He went straight to the system backups. He knew Elena wasn't technical. She believed deleting a text message meant it was gone forever. She didn't understand that the cloud remembered everything. He pulled up the message logs from the last 6 months. The name Julian appeared 312 times. Daniel opened the thread. It wasn't just an affair. It was an alternative reality. He scrolled past explicit photos, images of his wife in hotel rooms, in the studio, poses she had never offered him, and felt a dull, distant nausea. But the sex wasn't what made his hands cold. It was the conversation. Julian, Oct 14. He's still buying the low motility line? Elena, Oct 14. Hook, line, and sinker. He actually cried last night. It was exhausting. I had to comfort him for an hour. Julian, Oct 14. You're a saint. Just leave him, El. Elena, Oct 14. And give up the penthouse? The funding for the gallery? No, he's useful. Besides, if I leave, I'm the bad guy. If nature denies us a child, I'm the victim. The world loves a victim. Daniel stopped scrolling. The air in the room felt too thin. He's useful, he whispered to the empty room. He found the confirmation of the birth control in a chat with her sister Nora, a woman who had smiled at Daniel at Thanksgiving and toasted to his health. Nora, Septio 2. Are you still on Yaz? Be careful if he finds it. Elena, Septio 2. I hide it in the ugly art book he never touches. I'm not ruining my body with a parasite, Nora. I have an opening in spring. Besides, could you imagine a mini Daniel boring us all to death? Daniel leaned back, the leather chair groaning. The cruelty was casual. That was the worst part. They didn't hate him. They just didn't respect him enough to consider him human. He was a wallet, a prop, a useful idiot who provided the backdrop for her sparkling, tragic life. He plugged a terabyte external hard drive into the USB port. His movements were mechanical, precise. He dragged the entire message history, the photos, the location data, and the financial records he had found earlier into a folder he named Project Hudson. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 20%, 50%, 80%. He heard a rustle from the hallway. Daniel froze, his finger hovering over the mouse. Daniel? Elena's voice was sleep-thick, calling from the bedroom door. Are you working? He didn't minimize the window. He simply turned off the monitor screen, plunging the room into darkness. Just finishing a rendering for the city, El, he called back. His voice was steady. It sounded like his voice, but it came from a different man. Go back to sleep. "Don't be too long," she mumbled, and the footsteps retreated. Daniel turned the screen back on. Transfer complete. He ejected the drive and slipped it into the inside pocket of his briefcase. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the glittering grid of Manhattan. They thought he was boring. They thought he was weak. They forgot that he built skyscrapers. He knew how to dig a foundation, and he knew exactly how to use dynamite. The office of Eleanor Vance was located on the 42nd floor of a Glass Needle in Midtown, overlooking the park. Vance was 60, wore Chanel suits that looked like armor, and had a reputation for turning unfaithful spouses into cautionary tales. She didn't offer Daniel tea. She offered him a legal strategy that felt less like litigation and more like a surgical strike. "New York is an equitable distribution state," Vance said, reviewing the dossier Daniel had compiled. "But given the evidence of fraud, specifically the medical deception regarding your fertility to secure financial leverage, we have a very strong case for an annulment based on fraud, or at the very least, a settlement that leaves her with nothing but her gallery shares." "I don't care about the money," Daniel said, though he knew he should. "I do," Vance corrected him sharply, peering over her spectacles. "You earned it. She spent it, and she used your alleged biological failure as a tool to keep you docile. We aren't just going to divorce her, Daniel. We are going to correct the record." They spent the next hour mapping out the exit. It had to be precise. Daniel would transfer his liquid assets into a separate trust that afternoon. He would put the Tribeca penthouse on the market the moment he left. He would serve her papers not in private, but in a way that ensured the truth was codified in public record. The hardest part wasn't the legal maneuvering, it was going home. For the next 6 days, Daniel gave the performance of his life. He returned to the penthouse every evening at 7 p.m. He loosened his tie. He asked Elena about her day. He listened as she spun new webs of lies about stress and needing space to process their tragedy. On Wednesday, she sat on the edge of the bed, wearing a silk robe that slipped off one shoulder. "Julian thinks I should go to a wellness retreat in Sedona next week," she said, watching him in the mirror, "to heal my womb energy. It's expensive, but—" "Go," Daniel said, not looking up from his book. "Book the first-class ticket. You deserve it." She smiled, a predator satisfied with its praise submission. "You're so good to me, Daniel. Even when, when you can't give me what I really need." The insult landed, but it didn't sting anymore. It just confirmed the timeline. She was planning to meet Julian in Sedona on his dime. On Friday, 2 days before he planned to leave, they attended a fundraiser at the Met. Elena was in her element, clinging to his arm, whispering to donors about the struggles of conception. Daniel stood tall, holding a glass of champagne, nodding at the right moments. He caught sight of Julian across the room, a man with messy hair and an arrogant smirk, wearing a suit that Daniel had likely paid for indirectly through gallery commissions. Julian winked at Elena when he thought Daniel wasn't looking. Daniel didn't look away. He stared directly at Julian, raising his glass in a silent toast. "Enjoy it while it lasts," he thought, "because the bill is coming due." By Sunday morning, the preparations were complete. He had rented a storage unit in Queens for the few personal items he cared about. His grandfather's drafting table, his books, his collection of vintage vinyl. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the life they built, he was leaving behind. It was tainted. "I'm going to the studio for a few hours," Elena said, grabbing her keys. "Don't wait up for lunch." "I won't," Daniel said. He watched the elevator doors close on her for the last time. As soon as the numbers started descending, the clock started ticking. He didn't rush. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had already designed the demolition. Now he just had to push the button. He walked to the kitchen island, the marble cold under his palms. He took the envelope containing Dr. Sterling's fertility report and the divorce petition. He placed it squarely in the center of the counter, next to the bowl of organic lemons she insisted they display, but never eat. He took his wedding ring off. It made a hollow clink as he set it on top of the envelope. He grabbed his suitcase. He didn't look back at the view. He didn't look back at the life he was incinerating. He walked out the door, and for the first time in 3 years, he could breathe. The taxi merged onto the FDR Drive, the city skyline blurring into a streak of gray and steel against the rainy window. Daniel didn't look back at the Tribeca skyline. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He didn't just block Elena's number. He opened the carrier app and deactivated his line entirely. He removed the SIM card, balancing the tiny chip on his thumb for a moment, a small piece of plastic that had carried so many lies, so many feigned apologies, and dropped it into the ashtray of the cab. He felt weightless. It was a terrifying, exhilarating vertigo. He was 36 years old, and for the first time in a decade, he belonged to no one. 20 minutes later in the penthouse, the front door clicked open. Elena breezed in, shaking her umbrella. "Daniel, I'm back early." Julian was being moody. "Artists are so—" Her voice trailed off. The apartment had a specific quality of silence that was different from an empty room. It was the silence of a vacuum. The air felt still, undisturbed, as if the life had been sucked out of it hours ago. "Daniel." She walked down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood. She checked the bedroom. The bed was made, military tight, not the way the housekeeper did it. The closet door was ajar. She peered inside. His side of the walk-in closet wasn't just empty, it was erased. No suits, no shoes, no watch box. Even the wooden hangers were gone. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of her neck. "Daniel, this isn't funny," she whispered, pulling her phone out to call him. The call failed instantly. Service disconnected. Panic, sharp and sudden, spiked in her chest. She ran to the kitchen, the heart of their home, the stage for so many of their conversations about trying again. There on the pristine white marble island sat the only things he had left her: the envelope, the ring, and the keys. Elena approached the island slowly, as if the objects were rigged with explosives. In a way, they were. She picked up the platinum band first. It was cold. She dropped it, the metal ringing harsh against the stone. She opened the envelope. The first page wasn't a divorce petition. It was a medical report from the Sterling Institute. Patient, Daniel Thorne. Sperm count, 120 million ml, high normal. Motility, 85%, excellent. Morphology, normal. Conclusion: patient exhibits high fertility potential. No indications of male factor infertility. Elena read the lines twice. Her breath hitched. The blood drained from her face, leaving her rouge standing out like a bruise. He knew. He knew she had lied. He knew he wasn't broken. She flipped the page. The divorce petition was underneath, titled Thorne vs. Thorne. But it was the sticky note attached to the legal document that made her knees buckle. It was written in Daniel's precise, architectural block lettering. "I'm taking the dead end with me. You can keep the lie. The rent is paid until the end of the month. After that, ask Julian." Elena gripped the counter, her knuckles white. A sound tore from her throat, half scream, half sob. It wasn't sorrow. It was the terrified realization of a woman who had been performing on a high wire, only to look down and realize the net was gone. She scrambled for her phone again, dialing her mother, then her sister. "He left me," she screamed into the voicemail, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. He vanished. He knows, Mom. He knows everything." Across the city in a quiet hotel room overlooking Central Park, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. He poured a glass of water from the carafe. He didn't turn on the TV. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there listening to the hum of the city, savoring the one thing Elena could never give him: the truth. The silence in the penthouse was no longer peaceful. It was predatory. 2 days had passed since Daniel walked out, and the apartment felt vast and hostile. Elena had spent the first 24 hours in a state of manic indignation, waiting for him to call, to beg, to realize he couldn't function without her. He hadn't. Instead, the only communication she received was a notification from the bank. Joint account frozen pending litigation. She needed allies. She needed her mother. Elena dialed the number, preparing her voice to crack at just the right syllable. She would tell them Daniel had a mental break, that he was delusional, that he had abandoned her in her time of need. "Mom," Elena sobbed into the receiver the moment the line connected. "It's happened. Daniel left. He's gone crazy. We received the email, Elena." Her mother's voice was not warm. It was brittle, like dry leaves. Elena froze. What email? From Daniel's lawyer. Carbon copied to your father and me. It included a frighteningly detailed medical report from the Sterling Institute. There was a pause, heavy with judgment. You told us he was the broken one. For 3 years, we looked at that man with pity. We treated him like he was less than whole. Mom, you don't understand. He faked it. Stop it, her mother snapped. It was a tone Elena hadn't heard since she was a teenager caught shoplifting. The report is verified. And the chat logs, the messages with that sculptor? Your father is mortified. Do not come to Connecticut this weekend, Elena. We need time to figure out how to explain to our friends that our daughter is a liar. The line went dead. Elena stared at the phone. Her chest heaved. They had chosen him. They had chosen the outsider over their own blood because he had armed them with the one thing she couldn't spin. Facts. She needed to get out of the apartment. It smelled like Daniel, his cedar cologne still lingering in the foyer, and it made her sick. She grabbed her coat and hailed a cab to Brooklyn. She needed Julian. Julian loved her. He understood her soul. They were artists. They existed above the mundane morality of people like Daniel and her parents. She arrived at Julian's studio in Bushwick just as the sun was setting. The space was drafty, smelling of turpentine and cheap cigarettes. Julian was welding a piece of scrap metal, sparks flying. He looked up, surprised but not thrilled. Elena, you didn't text. He knows, Elena said, rushing to him, burying her face in his stained t-shirt. He found out. Everything. He left, Julian. We're free. Julian pulled back slightly, lifting his welding mask. His handsome face was smeared with soot, but his eyes were calculating. Free? What do you mean, free? He filed for divorce. Annulment, actually. He's gone. She tried to smile, to summon the conspiratorial romance they usually shared. It's just us now. I can move in here. We can finally be the power couple we talked about. Julian looked around the studio, a converted garage with no heating and a mattress on the floor. He looked back at Elena, taking in her Chanel bag and her manicure. Elena, he said, wiping his hands on a rag, you can't live here. This isn't a penthouse. And without Daniel, how does the gallery get funded? Who pays the rent on the space? We'll figure it out, she said, her voice rising in pitch. I thought you wanted me. You said Daniel was a bore. You said he was a chain around my neck. He was a chain made of gold, Julian muttered, tossing the rag onto a workbench. I'm an artist, Elle. I can barely feed myself. I liked us because it was exciting. Stolen moments. High stakes. But domesticity? Poverty? He shook his head, a cruel smirk touching his lips. That's not really my medium. Elena stepped back. The cold of the studio seeped into her bones. She realized with a sickening clarity that Julian hadn't been in love with her. He had been in love with the lifestyle she stole from Daniel. You're a coward, she whispered. And you, Julian said, turning back to his welding torch, are technically homeless. You should probably go. He flipped the mask down, igniting the torch. The sparks flew again, a wall of fire between them. Elena turned and walked out into the gray industrial street. She stood on the curb, shivering, realizing she had burned down her house to warm her hands, only to find the fire had gone out, leaving her in the dark. Time did not heal all wounds, Daniel realized, but it certainly built new tissue over the scars. 5 years had passed since he left the key on the marble island. He was no longer the man who sat in silent, sterile dining rooms in Tribeca, afraid to breathe too loudly lest he disturb the curated atmosphere of his marriage. He was now a man who lived in a constant, joyful state of noise. The kitchen of his colonial house in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a disaster zone of the best kind. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows, illuminating a battlefield of flour, spilled orange juice, and Lego bricks. Daddy, look! A tower! Leo, 4 years old and possessing Daniel's exact jawline, tugged at his pant leg. I see it, buddy. It's taller than the fridge, Daniel said, hoisting the boy onto his hip. Sarah stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. She wasn't wearing Yves Saint Laurent. She was wearing one of Daniel's old university t-shirts and pajama bottoms, her hair in a messy bun that was falling apart. She looked back at him and smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. There was no performance in it. Is Maya up? Sarah asked, sliding a pancake onto a plate. She's negotiating with the teddy bears in her crib. Daniel laughed. I think the bears are winning. He walked over and kissed his wife on the cheek. He rested his hand on the small swell of her stomach. Their third child was due in the spring. 3 children in 4 years. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who was once diagnosed as a genetic dead end by a lying wife was now populating his own corner of the world. He didn't think about Elena often. Not anymore. In the first year, anger had been a constant companion, a bitter taste in his mouth whenever he paid the legal bills. But then he met Sarah, a pediatric nurse who didn't care about his money and certainly didn't care about the art world. She loved him for his quiet strength, not his utility. When he did think of Elena, it was with a distant, dull pity. 40 miles away, in a one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, the morning was perfectly silent. Elena sat at a small bistro table, drinking black coffee. The apartment was chic, but it was small. The Tribeca penthouse had been sold during the divorce settlements. The proceeds split, but legal fees and bad investments had drained her share. She checked her phone. Instagram showed her photos of the old crowd. Julian had moved to Berlin with a 22-year-old performance artist. Her parents were in Florida and rarely called. The gallery she managed had closed last month. The owner said the market was shifting, but Elena knew the truth. She had lost her spark. She scrolled through her feed, stopping on a photo of a mutual friend who had visited Connecticut. In the background of the shot, blurred but unmistakable, was Daniel. He was pushing a swing. He looked older, tired perhaps, but he looked solid, real. Elena zoomed in on the photo until the pixels blurred. She looked at his hands, the hands she had once held, the hands she had convinced herself were useless. She put the phone down, face down, on the table. The silence of the apartment pressed in on her ears. It used to be a sign of sophistication, of a life uncluttered by children and mess. Now it just felt like a waiting room for a train that had already left the station. She stood up and walked to the mirror. She applied her lipstick, a perfect shade of red. She had a brunch to attend, a new group of friends to impress. She would tell them about her tragic past, about the ex-husband who couldn't handle her ambition. She would spin the web again, but deep down, looking at the fine lines etching themselves around her eyes. Elena knew the truth. The audience was shrinking, and the curtain was coming down. Back in Connecticut, a crash of plastic blocks echoed from the living room, followed by a peal of laughter. Daniel didn't wince. He didn't wish for silence. He walked into the chaos, ready to build the tower again. The wedding reception was being held at the Delamar Hotel in Greenwich, a venue that smelled of salt water and old money. Elna stood on the terrace, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't sipped in 20 minutes. She was there as the +1 of a gallery owner she was trying to court for a job, a man 10 years her senior who had spent the entire cocktail hour talking about his ex-wife. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the polite laughter, the jazz quartet, suddenly felt abrasive. Elena smoothed the skirt of her dress, a vintage piece she had convinced herself was chic rather than dated, and walked down the stone steps toward the harbor park. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves. It was a beautiful Saturday, the kind of day that mocked lonely people with its perfection. She walked aimlessly along the path, watching the boats bob in the water. Ahead, a small playground was filled with the chaotic energy of families. She usually avoided such places. Children were sticky, loud reminders of a life she had opted out of. But a laugh stopped her. It was a deep, resonant laugh, a sound she hadn't heard in 5 years, but which she knew better than her own heartbeat. Elena froze behind the trunk of a large oak tree. Her breath caught in her throat. 50 feet away, pushing a tire swing, was Daniel. He looked different. The tension that used to carry his shoulders up toward his ears was gone. He wore a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up and worn denim jeans. Clothes the old Daniel, the Daniel she had molded, would never have worn in public. He looked rugged. He looked happy. "Higher, Daddy, higher!" The scream came from the boy in the swing. He was about 4 years old. Elena squinted. The boy had dark, curly hair. He had the same sharp nose, the same determined set of the jaw. Hold on tight, Leo, Daniel called out. Another child, a girl with pigtails who looked to be about 2, waddled over to him and grabbed his leg. Up, up, she commanded. Daniel scooped her up effortlessly, settling her onto his shoulders. Okay, Maya, you're the lookout. Elena felt the ground tilt beneath her heels. 2. There were 2 of them, and she could see a woman sitting on a nearby bench, heavily pregnant, laughing as she took a photo of the trio. The lie she had told, the genetic dead end, the low motility, the medical impossibility, shattered into dust right there on the pavement. The problem had never been his biology. It had been her chemistry. She had spent years convincing him he was a dessert, only to watch him bloom into a garden the moment he was transplanted to better soil. As if sensing eyes on him, Daniel turned. He stopped swinging the tire. The smile didn't drop from his face, but it stilled. Across the expanse of green grass and scattered autumn leaves, their eyes locked. Elena waited for him to look angry. She waited for him to look vindictive, to point at his children and mouth, "See?" She waited for some acknowledgement of their shared history, some spark of the drama she thrived on. But there was nothing. His gaze was calm. It was the way a traveler looks at a landmark from a city they visited once. Long ago, familiar, but irrelevant to their current journey. He didn't nod. He didn't wave. He simply turned his head back to his son. "Ready for the big push, Leo?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying on the wind. "Yes!" Daniel pushed the swing, sending his son soaring toward the sky. Elena stood there for a long time, the champagne warm in her hand. The wind off the water was cold, biting through her silk dress. She turned around and walked back toward the hotel, toward the party full of strangers, toward a future that was as empty and perfectly curated as a gallery with no art on the walls. The echo of the children's laughter followed her, louder than the silence she was going home to.